Well, good morning. Welcome to Parent Connect. Again, I'm not there in person. I'm actually a few floors above you, teaching the new members class this morning. But we figured we would go ahead and record the teaching, and it went well last time as far as I heard. So we'll go ahead and do that this morning, and I'll stop and pause, and there'll be a timer for you to discuss some things at your table. But here we go. We're in Numbers chapter 13 and 14. Just a little bit of a recap here. The people of Israel, they've been, delivered. This is my Egypt. They've been delivered out of Egypt, and God brought them to a mountain, Mount Sinai, to make a covenant with them, a partnership agreement. He wants to make them into a kingdom of priests or a nation of image bearers, where he can expand his blessing throughout the world by blessing them. In order to do that, he gives them some instruction. Here we go. There's 10 commandments. We call this Torah. Sometimes it's translated law, but that's instruction for them for how they can fulfill that role and that responsibility in being a kingdom of priests or a nation of image bearers. He also gives them some instruction for building this thing down here. A tabernacle. This was a mobile temple so that God's presence would be with them wherever they go, wherever they travel throughout the wilderness. And so they're ready. They've been at this mountain for a long time. Half of the book of Exodus is there. The whole book of Leviticus is there. And half the book of Numbers is all taking place at this mountain, Mount Sinai. So now they're leaving after they take a big census, which is where the beginning of, the name of Numbers in English gets its name, because there's a lot of numbers at the beginning of Numbers. But now we're on the fun part. They're actually going to start their journey, and they come to basically the border of the land, or the time to enter the promised land, because that's where they're going. They're going to the promised land of Canaan. And so it's time to go there. That's where we're at in this story. Numbers 13. And the Lord spoke to Moses, "Send men to scout out the land," or spy. Usually when you hear this in kids' stories, they talk about the 12 spies. And it's talking about scouting the land. The land of Canaan, or Canaan is usually how we say it, I'm giving to the Israelites. Send one man who is a leader among them from each of their ancestral tribes. And so Moses sent them from the wilderness of Paran at the Lord's command. All the men were leaders in Israel, and these were their names. We're going to skip all their names down to verse 17. So they name all of the guys who are the scouts, and Moses now gives his instruction. When Moses sent them to scout out the land of Canaan, he told them, "Go up this way to the Negev, then go up into the hill country. See what the land is like, and whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. Is the land they live in good or bad? Are the cities they live in encampments or fortifications? Is the land fertile or unproductive? Are there trees in it or not? Be courageous, bring back some fruit from the land." It was the season for the first ripe grapes. So they went up and scouted the land from the wilderness of Zin as far as Rehob, near the entrance of Hamath. They went up through the Negev and came to Hebron, where Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak, these are key. We don't know about that. We could go and research that. But this was scary people for them, enemies. Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. Interesting detail. When they came to the Eshcol Valley, they cut down a branch with a single cluster of grapes, which was carried on a pole by 2 men. So this is a big cluster of grapes. It takes 2 men and a pole to carry. They also took some pomegranates and figs. That place was called Eshcol Valley because of the cluster of grapes the Israelites cut there. At the end of 40 days, they returned from scouting the land. Okay, I want us to ask 2 questions about this passage. Okay, maybe you don't typically hear this passage and think about these 2 questions, but I think we should. So these are the 2 questions I want to send you to your tables to discuss, okay? First, why did God send the scouts? Why did he do it? He didn't have to do it. He could have just sent them into the land. And based on, what we'll see, some of it was kind of scary. So maybe it would have been better if God didn't send out scouts. Anyway, so God, why is he sending out the scouts? Second, read Moses' instructions carefully. Read them closely and see if anything strange draws your attention. Just think about the nature of these instructions and if they spark anything in you. Okay? So go ahead, talk about this at your table for a good amount of time, and don't be afraid to throw out some wild things. All right? 10 minutes. Okay, let's scroll down here. Why did God send the scouts? Unfortunately, I'm not there to hear some of the things that you all discussed, and I'm sure it was great and stimulating conversation. You know, one commentator talks about how this was to prep Israel for future military conquests. If God just sent them into the land without scouting the land beforehand, they wouldn't be prepared to scout lands and kind of figure out that was a normal way to do military missions. There was this scouting that needed to happen first. So maybe God was training them for those future events. I don't buy that interpretation because this didn't just have to do with military. Part of the scouting also had to do with the land and the fertility of it and its fruit and things like that. So I think the nature of the instructions see that this is more than just a military preparation. There's something else happening here. So when we look at the actual instructions, I think it can answer the question, help us answer the question, why did God send the scouts? And so as you read this closely, I hope a few things stuck out to you. I'm going to highlight them as we go. I'm just going to start in verse 19 and then skip down to verse 23 to show some of the key terms and images that I think would have stuck out to the original readers. Is the land they live in good or bad? Are the cities they live in encampments or fortification? Is the land fertile or unproductive? Are there trees in it or not? Be courageous. Bring back some fruit from the land. It was the season for the first ripe grapes. They cut down, they brought fruit, and they also came and they had some pomegranates and figs. None of these details may initially, on their own, stick out to us. Some of it could seem like generally good things to investigate, but some of it seems kind of strange. Like, are there trees in it? It's kind of a weird thing to look for, and it's kind of specific. But can you think of any other land that has similar imagery or elements tied up in it? These notion of good or bad, trees, fruit, figs. All of this imagery resonates with Genesis 2 and 3. Figs specifically. It's only been mentioned back in Genesis 3 so far in the biblical story. It was mentioned in Genesis 3 when the man and the woman, they ate of the fruit. They saw their nakedness. They tried to sew fig leaves together to hide their nakedness. And then the next time we read about it is here in this story. Now, why is that making too big of a deal? Well, maybe not. But I've been convinced, reading the Bible enough, that the Bible uses details this way. It stitches them together to kind of prompt you or remind you of another story in the Bible. And usually it helps you understand what's going on here. And I think what's happening here with the use of these details is the writer of the Bible wants to remind you of this event, the first test. I think that's what the writer of the Bible wants us to do. A lot of these ideas, the notion of good or bad, a tree, fruit, figs, it reminds us of the first test. Adam and Eve, they were in the garden, in the land, and there was a tree of good and evil. It's the same Hebrew phrase here, tov va-ra. It's translated good or bad here, but in Genesis 2, same phrase as good and evil. And this tree of good and evil had some forbidden fruit on it. And whether they ate that fruit or not was the test. It was the test. So I think what the instructions of the scouting initiative show us is that God is testing them. God is testing the people. He's sending them out as a kind of test. We know that God's been doing this throughout the wilderness, right? We talked about this last week. The place of the wilderness is a place of testing. And so God is here providing another test. He wants them to see. He wants them to see in themselves, and also he wants to draw out their trust or distrust. So let's see, how do they do? How do they do with this test? Numbers 13, the men went back to Moses, Aaron, and the entire Israelite community in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back a report for them and the whole community. They showed them the fruit of the land. They reported to Moses, "We went to the land where you sent us. Indeed, it is flowing with milk and honey, and here is some of its fruit." So starts with the good. The good news before the bad news, old trick. But then there comes this, however, the people living in the land are strong, and the cities are large and fortified. We also saw the descendants of Anak there, and then they're going to list all these enemies that they saw. The Amalekites, the Hethites, Jebusites, Amorites, and the Canaanites. These are all enemies in the land that they take notice of. Then Caleb quieted the people in the presence of Moses, said, "Let's go up now and take possession of the land, because we can certainly conquer it." As the other scouts are seemingly failing the test, Caleb is here passing the test. He trusts, despite the enemies, despite the hardships, the land is good, and God is with them, and they can conquer. He trusts God's voice here. But the men who had gone up with him responded, "We can't attack the people because they're stronger than we are. They're stronger than we are." So they gave a negative report to the Israelites about the land they had scouted. The land we passed through to explore is one that devours its inhabitants. And all the people we saw in the land are men of great size. We even saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. And this goes back to a story in Genesis 6, which we can't go into here. But go read Genesis 6 for more information on the Nephilim. These are scary individuals that they rightfully should be afraid of. They're kind of like, they parallel to the serpent in Genesis 3. That's all I'll say. They are parallel to the serpent and a bad spiritual power. To ourselves, we must have seemed like grasshoppers, and we must have seemed the same to them. Grasshoppers, they looked small. They looked easily conquered. They're just afraid, right? So their report here, it's filled with distrust. It's filled with them failing the test. But what I want us to look at is this whole phrase, a negative report. A negative report. They gave a negative report about the land. This is a debah. This is often sometimes translated as gossip or slander. So they're slandering the promised land. They're slandering and giving a negative depiction of God's good promised land. This is offensive. This is offensive to them. And just another little tidbit here. We've read about a debah, a negative report already in the biblical story with the person of Joseph. This is what Joseph did about his brothers to his father back in Genesis 37 or so. But he gossiped about them. He slandered them. He was offensive towards them. He discredited them. And for the Israelites here, these scouts, they're discrediting the promised land, the land that's flowing with milk and honey and blessing and promise and goodness. And so this is an insult to God. This is an insult to God. And this is the people listen to this discrediting report and so distrust God. And again, this reminds us of Genesis 3. In Genesis 3, the man and woman failed the test because they believed a discrediting report about God and his goodness. They believed the serpent's lies and the seeded doubts of the serpent, that God didn't really care for them or have their best interests in mind. And so what we see is we fail the test when we choose to listen to the wrong voices, especially lies. Lies are dangerous. They lead to distrust, and that's why lies are so powerful. So we fail the test when we choose to listen to the wrong voices, and this often leads to grumbling and complaining. So let's read about the people's grumbling and complaining and how they respond. The whole community broke into loud cries. The people wept that night. All the Israelites complained about Moses and Aaron, and the whole community told them, "If only we had died in the land of Egypt." We know that phrase. We've read that before. Or if only we had died in the wilderness. They'll die wherever at this point. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to die by the sword? Our wives and children will become plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? So they said to one another, "Let's appoint a leader and go back to Egypt." So what do they want to do? They want to turn back. They want to return to slavery. They want to return to a life of slavery. And this is all motivated by fear, right? They see this fear for their well-being, but also a distrust that God's bringing them into this land so that they could die by the sword. That's just such an irrational belief, right? Such an irrational thing. So they have all these fears, and it's causing them to distrust. I think there's a question here of why would we want to return to slavery? Right? If we can kind of map this onto our own experience, why would we ever want to return to our former way of life? And there's something here about fear, distrust, belief in lies, that causes us to retreat back to our former ways of life. Paul has a lot to say about this, the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, in the book of Galatians, chapters 3 and 4, if you kind of really want to tease that out more. But I think we have this same temptation at times that gets filled out with some of the same reasons. But for now, just think about how offensive this is to God. Think of the insult that this is to him. It totally discounts what God has done for them. It totally discounts the rescue that he has provided. It's as if God has never done that. It's as if God had never delivered them from the land of Egypt. And so this is an insult to God, who he is, his plan, his redemption, his great dramatic acts of rescue in the Exodus. This is insulting to him and offensive. So let's see how the Lord responds here. The Lord said to Moses, "How long will these people despise me?" Right? See, that's what's happening here. They're despising God. How long will they not trust in me, despite all the signs I've performed among them? I will strike them with a plague and destroy them. Then I will make you, and this is Moses, into a greater and mightier nation than they are. So what does God want to do? Well, he's kind of seemingly lost his patience with his people, and he wants to reset and start again with Moses. A similar thing happened in Exodus 32 with the golden calf. If you're familiar with that story, Israel was making an idol, and God said some similar things, that he wanted to start over again with Moses. But in both cases, and scholars make a good point, in both cases, what we see is Moses speaks up and kind of challenges God on that idea. And scholars make the point that it's almost as if the Lord is prompting Moses to stand in the gap for the people. God's like, "I'm done with these people, Moses. I'm going to start over with you." And he's kind of pulling Moses out to be an intercessor or a priest, a mediator, a stand-in for the people, to kind of argue with God and challenge with God. So when Moses hears the Lord's response, that God wants to wipe out Israel and start over again with Moses, Moses actually argues with God. And that might hit you weird. Argue with God. Are we supposed to argue with God? Is that what Moses was supposed to do or not? And I think if you think of it as a different word, as he wanted, God wanted Moses to protest this idea or to petition on behalf of the people. And usually in Christian circles, we call this prayer, specifically intercessory prayer. If you're a super Christian, you know that phrase. But this is what prayer is. This is specifically what intercessory prayer is. You stand in the gap for other people. You stand in the gap for other people and you pray on their behalf. You seek their good. And this is what Moses is doing here. He's standing in the gap for these people. He's praying on their behalf. And we are called to do this as followers of Jesus. We're called to pray for those who are in need. Ultimately, those who need God's deliverance and promise to be true in their lives. But what we can see here, this is what I'm going to send you to your tables to do, is look at Moses' prayer, his petition, his protest, as kind of a model for what intercessory prayer should look like. This is Moses standing in the gap for the people, praying on their behalf. How can Moses' prayer be a model for my own prayer when I pray for others? Specifically those closest to us. Right? These were Moses' people. How does this inform, how does Moses' prayer inform how you pray for your family, your children, those closest to you in need? So highlight some key things that show how we should pray and intercede for others. I'm going to give you a good amount of time to discuss these. Try to get practical. Even as you see these elements, say, oh, well, this is a way that I could pray. And if you have time, you can compare it to Exodus 32, 7 through 14, where Moses does a similar thing. So take a few minutes at your table, highlight those key things to praying for others, and then we'll come back and I'll close it out. All right, I'll welcome you back here. I just noted a few things, and maybe you noted these, or maybe you noted even more. And that's good. I think there's a lot we could read into here. I just noted a few things. One, you see Moses, he's continually praying for the sake of God's name and his fame. So he's concerned about the people's well-being, but he's also concerned about what this would say about God. Since these are God's people, he's concerned about God's name, his reputation. He's concerned about how this provides a witness to those who don't have God as their God. What does it say about God if his people are not brought into the land and the promise is not fulfilled? What will that say to Egypt? Moses says. And so these are the big things that Moses is concerned for. It's not simply a particular, blessing or prosperity in the moment. He's concerned with the very reputation of God to his people and to others. A big thing is the fulfillment of the promise. He's saying, Moses is saying, you promised these people, you promised that your people would enter the land. You are a covenant-keeping God. He's appealing to God's character here. And that's what his prayers are outfitted with is, God, if you are this, then this doesn't line up with your character. Specifically, not only his faithfulness, right? This is God's faithfulness, but also his loving, merciful character. He appeals to God's love. His mercy, he says, you may be a God of judgment, but you are a God of love. And so he appeals to those things. And this is how he argues with God. He protests to God in prayer and saying, God, you are loving. God, you are a covenant-keeping God. God, your fame and glory are tied up in your people. Protect your name, protect your glory. And that's a model. There's some big ideas there for how we should pray for other people. This whole idea of fulfillment of the promise, I think this is a good definition of prayer. It's calling on the name of God, the reputation of God, Yahweh, to keep the promise. There are times in our life where it doesn't look like God is keeping the promise. There will be times in our life where it doesn't look like God's fulfillment has come about. That's what Moses was seeing here. He was saying, God, if you do that, then you're not going to fulfill your promise. So prayer is what we do when we see that it doesn't look like God is going to fulfill his promise. But prayer becomes the mechanism of saying, no, Lord, I'm calling on your name to keep your covenant, keep your promise. And the fascinating thing is, God actually uses Moses' prayer to keep his promise. Moses' prayer was a tool, an instrument for God to keep his covenant faithfulness. But it started by saying, it doesn't look like that. So prayers are powerful. Prayers change things from our kind of perspective and how we're dealing with, seeing God's plan unfold. God wants us to pray, and he wants his prayers, the prayers of his people, to actually inspire his covenant faithfulness. But I think there's something beautiful there, and it helps inform some of our prayers. Okay? Well, I'm sure we're close to time here, and I just thanks again for being a part of the class. Hopefully, again, this video was helpful, and it worked well, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. Thanks.